The sound of metal wheels scraping against marble echoed through the courthouse hallway as 10-year-old Marcus Williams struggled to right himself, his small hands trembling as they pressed against the cold floor. Blood trickled from a scrape on his knee where he had fallen when Officer Bradley Matthews yanked him from his wheelchair with unnecessary force. The boy's mother, Diane, rushed forward with tears streaming down her face. But Officer Sarah Chen stepped between them, her hand resting threateningly on her baton. "Stay back, ma'am. Your son was obstructing official courthouse business," Chen declared, her voice carrying through the marble corridors with an authority that made other visitors stop and stare. The accusation was absurd. Marcus had been sitting quietly in his wheelchair near the wall, well out of any walkway, simply waiting for his father to finish his work. But logic seemed irrelevant to the two officers, who now stood over the disabled child like predators cornering their prey. Marcus looked up at the officers with wide, confused eyes that held no understanding of why this was happening to him. At 10 years old, he had already endured more medical procedures and hospital stays than most adults would face in a lifetime. Born with spina bifida, he had learned to navigate the world from the seat of his wheelchair with remarkable resilience and an infectious smile that could light up any room. Today, however, that smile had vanished, replaced by the kind of fear that no child should ever have to experience. "Please," Diane whispered, her voice breaking as she watched her son struggle on the floor. "He's just a child. He hasn't done anything wrong." Officer Matthews, a burly man with close-cropped hair and a permanent scowl, bent down toward Marcus with deliberate menace. "Listen here, boy. This is a federal courthouse, not some playground where you can park yourself wherever you please. You people need to learn some respect for the law." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications clear to everyone within earshot. Several courthouse employees had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces showing various degrees of shock and disgust at what they were witnessing. Among them stood Rebecca Morrison, a court clerk who had worked in this building for 15 years and had never seen anything quite like this display of cruelty. "Officer, with all due respect," Rebecca began, stepping forward cautiously. "The child wasn't blocking anything. He was sitting quietly by the wall." Chen whirled around to face her, eyes flashing with anger. "Are you questioning our judgment, civilian? Because I can have you removed from this building just as easily." The threat silenced Rebecca, but not before she managed to whisper, "This isn't right," under her breath. Meanwhile, Marcus had managed to pull himself up slightly, his thin arms shaking with the effort. The sight of this small, vulnerable child trying so desperately to regain his dignity should have moved anyone with a functioning conscience to immediate action. Instead, it seemed to fuel the officer's cruelty. "Where do you think you're going?" Matthews grabbed Marcus's shoulder roughly, causing the boy to cry out in pain. "You're not moving from this spot until we've completed our investigation into your disruptive behavior." Diane could no longer contain herself. "Investigation? He's 10 years old. He's disabled. What investigation could you possibly need to conduct on a child who was sitting quietly?" Her voice carried a mother's desperation, the raw emotion of someone watching their child being tormented by those sworn to protect and serve. But rather than eliciting any sympathy from the officers, her outburst seemed to escalate their aggression. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down immediately, we'll be forced to detain you as well," Chen threatened, pulling out her handcuffs and letting them dangle prominently from her fingers. Interfering with a police investigation is a serious crime. Marcus looked between his mother and the officers, his young mind trying to process the nightmare unfolding around him. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice so small it was barely audible. "I want to go home." The simple plea of a frightened child should have ended this travesty immediately. instead. Matthews laughed a cruel, mocking sound that reverberated off the courthouse walls. "Homeboy, you're not going anywhere until we decide you've learned your lesson about proper courthouse etiquette." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as one of the most shocking displays of police brutality they had ever seen. Matthews reached down and grabbed Marcus's wheelchair, which had been sitting empty since they had forcibly removed the child from it. With deliberate malice, he began wheeling it away from Marcus, leaving the disabled boy stranded on the floor. "No!" Marcus cried out, his voice cracking with panic. "Please, I need that. I can't walk." But Matthews continued moving the wheelchair down the hallway, stopping only when he reached a janitor's closet. He opened the door and shoved the wheelchair inside, then turned back to face the growing crowd of horrified onlookers. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he announced, his voice booming with misplaced authority. "This courthouse demands respect and proper behavior from everyone, regardless of age or condition." The word condition dripped with disdain, as if Marcus's disability was somehow a personal failing rather than a medical reality he had been born with. Chen nodded in approval at her partner's actions, clearly viewing this public humiliation as a job well done. Diane had reached her breaking point. She pushed past Chen's attempted blockade and knelt beside her son, gathering him into her arms despite the officer's protests. "Samuel is going to hear about this," she said quietly, but her words carried a weight that made several people in the crowd exchange curious glances. "Samuel." Matthews laughed again, that same cruel sound that had become the soundtrack to this horror show. "And who exactly is Samuel, your boyfriend, your baby daddy? Let me guess he's going to come down here and teach us a lesson." The racist implications of his comments were crystal clear, and the gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca Morrison, who had been quietly documenting the entire incident on her phone, stopped recording and looked toward the elevator with an expression of growing anticipation. She alone among the witnesses seemed to understand the significance of Diane's mention of Samuel. "My husband," Diane said simply, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the officer's crude behavior, "will indeed want to know how his son was treated in his own courthouse." Matthews was about to deliver another mocking response when the soft ding of the elevator interrupted him. The door slid open with mechanical precision, and the hallway fell into an eerie silence as a tall, distinguished black man in full judicial robes stepped out. Judge Samuel Harris moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect through presence rather than volume, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him with growing horror and rage. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Marcus, still cradled in his mother's arms on the cold marble floor, looked up and saw his father. The relief that washed over the child's face was immediately replaced by shame, not for anything he had done, but for being seen in such a vulnerable, humiliated state. "Daddy," he whispered, the word carrying all the pain and confusion a 10-year-old could express in a single syllable. Judge Harris took in every detail of the scene: his son on the floor, his wife's tear-stained face, the missing wheelchair, and the two officers standing over his family like conquering warriors. When his gaze finally settled on Matthews and Chen, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop by several degrees. "Officers," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I am Judge Samuel Harris of the Federal District Court. Would you care to explain why my 10-year-old disabled son is sitting on the floor of my courthouse?" The color drained from Matthews's face so quickly that several witnesses later compared it to watching a magic trick. Chen's hand, which had been resting confidently on her baton, began to tremble visibly. The crowd of onlookers collectively held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Your Honor," Matthews stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. That is, the situation required. The boy was obstructing. "The boy," Judge Harris interrupted, his voice cutting through Matthews's fumbling explanation like a blade, "has a name. Marcus. And Marcus is my son." He moved past the officers and knelt beside his family, helping Diane lift Marcus from the floor. The contrast between the gentleness he showed his son and the barely contained fury in his eyes as he looked at the officers was striking. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his judicial authority. "Where is his wheelchair?" Chen found her voice first, though it came out as little more than a squeak. We placed it in secure storage as part of our investigation." Investigation. Judge Harris stood slowly, his full height now imposing over the two officers. "Into what crime? Exactly. Do you suspect my 10-year-old son of committing—" The question hung in the air like a challenge that neither officer seemed capable of meeting. Their earlier justifications about courthouse obstructions and disruptive behavior suddenly sounded absurd when forced to explain them to a federal judge whose son they had just humiliated. What none of them knew, what would only be discovered later, was that the entire incident had been captured in crystal clear detail by the courthouse's new high-definition security system. More importantly, due to a technical oversight during a system upgrade the previous week, the security feed had been inadvertently connected to the courthouse's live streaming network, which was typically used for broadcasting high-profile court proceedings to the public. Across the city, hundreds of people had watched the entire confrontation unfold in real time on their computers and phones, thanks to a link that had been automatically shared on the courthouse's social media accounts. The footage showed everything: Marcus sitting quietly in his wheelchair, the officer's unprovoked aggression, the child's frightened tears, and the cruel confiscation of his mobility aid. Judge Harris was unaware of this technological twist of fate as he faced down the two officers who had tormented his family. His immediate concern was for Marcus, who was clinging to his father's robes with small, shaking hands. "Daddy, I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus whispered, his voice muffled against his father's chest. "I was just waiting for you like Mommy said." The simple honesty of his son's words hit Judge Harris like a physical blow. He had spent his entire career working within a system designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Yet here, in his own courthouse, his own child had been subjected to treatment that would have been criminal in any context. "I know, son," he said softly, his hand stroking Marcus's hair with infinite tenderness. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all." Then he turned his attention back to the officers, and his voice took on the tone that had made him legendary in legal circles: quiet, precise, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled fury. "Officers Matthews and Chen, you are both hereby suspended from duty pending a full federal investigation into civil rights violations, child abuse, and misconduct under color of authority. You will surrender your badges and weapons immediately." Matthews found his voice, though it cracked with desperation. "Your Honor, you can't. I mean, we were just doing our jobs. The boy was—" "The boy," Judge Harris repeated, his voice rising for the first time, "is a disabled child who was sitting quietly in a public space, bothering no one. You assaulted him, humiliated him, and confiscated the medical equipment he needs to move independently. In what universe does that constitute doing your job?" By now, the hallway had filled with courthouse employees, attorneys, and visitors who had heard the commotion. Among them were several prominent members of the legal community who recognized Judge Harris and understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. Rebecca Morrison stepped forward, her phone still in her hand. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, "I recorded the entire incident. I thought someone should document what was happening." Judge Harris nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Rebecca. That footage will be crucial evidence in the criminal proceedings I intend to file." Criminal proceedings. The word sent a chill through both officers, who were beginning to realize that their actions might have consequences far beyond a simple reprimand or suspension. Chen made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, please. We were just following protocol for suspicious individuals who—" Suspicious individuals. Judge Harris's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "My son is suspicious. A 10-year-old child in a wheelchair, sitting quietly with his mother, is suspicious." The racial implications of Chen's words were clear to everyone present, and the silence that followed was deafening. Even Matthews, who had shown no shame throughout the earlier confrontation, seemed to understand that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. At that moment, building security arrived, having been alerted by the growing crowd. When the head of security, Michael Torres, saw Judge Harris holding his son, while Diane wiped tears from her eyes, his face immediately darkened with understanding. "Your Honor," Torres said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "what do you need from us?" "Please escort these officers from the building." Judge Harris replied, "They are no longer welcome in this courthouse. Also, please retrieve my son's wheelchair from wherever they've hidden it." Torres nodded and gestured to his team. Within minutes, they had located Marcus's wheelchair in the janitor's closet and brought it back to the family. Matthews and Chen were led away, their protests falling on deaf ears as the crowd watched their departure with undisguised satisfaction. As Marcus was gently helped back into his wheelchair, Judge Harris knelt beside him once more. "Are you hurt anywhere else? Son, do you need to see a doctor?" Marcus shook his head, though the scrape on his knee was still bleeding. "I'm okay, Daddy. But I don't understand why they were so mean to me." The question that every parent dreads the moment when a child's innocence collides with the reality of hatred and prejudice in the world. Judge Harris took a deep breath, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable without destroying his son's faith in humanity. "Sometimes, Marcus, people do cruel things because they're afraid or angry about things that have nothing to do with you. It doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means that some people haven't learned how to be kind yet." It was an imperfect explanation for an inexcusable situation, but Marcus nodded, as if it made sense to him. Children, Judge Harris reflected, often displayed a wisdom and resilience that adults could learn from. Over the following days, as news of the incident spread through social and traditional media, the courthouse became a focal point for community outrage. The inadvertently live-streamed footage had been viewed millions of times, sparking protests and calls for justice that reached far beyond the local community. Legal experts on television praised Judge Harris's restraint in the moment, noting that many parents would have responded with physical violence to seeing their child treated so cruelly. The officers' union initially attempted to defend Matthews and Chen, issuing a statement about the challenging nature of courthouse security and the split-second decisions required in such situations. However, when the full video footage was released, showing Marcus sitting peacefully for nearly 20 minutes before the officers approached him, the union quickly withdrew their support and announced that the two officers were being expelled from the organization. 3 weeks after the incident, the community gathered for what had been scheduled as a routine judicial review meeting. These monthly sessions typically drew a small crowd of legal professionals and civic-minded citizens interested in courthouse operations and local justice issues. Tonight, however, the meeting had moved to the Civic Center to accommodate the hundreds of people who wanted to attend. Judge Harris had been asked to address the community about the incident and the subsequent investigation. As he approached the podium, the crowd fell silent, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger, sympathy, and anticipation. Behind him, on a large screen, the video footage of Marcus's humiliation played on a loop, serving as a stark reminder of why they had all gathered. 3 weeks ago, Judge Harris began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. My family experienced something that no family should ever have to endure. My son Marcus, a 10-year-old child whose greatest crime was existing while disabled and black in a public space, was assaulted and humiliated by 2 officers sworn to protect and serve our community. A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd, but Judge Harris continued. I want to be clear about something. This was not an isolated incident of poor judgment or miscommunication. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate cruelty, racist behavior, and abuse of power that demands not just condemnation, but criminal prosecution. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. Today, I am announcing that federal charges have been filed against Officers Bradley Matthews and Sarah Chen for civil rights violations, assault on a minor, and misconduct under color of authority. The FBI's Civil Rights Division has taken over the investigation, and both officers will face the full weight of federal justice. The crowd erupted in applause, but Judge Harris raised his hand for silence. However, punishment alone is not enough. We must also focus on prevention and healing. I am therefore announcing the establishment of the Marcus Williams Fund for Disabled Children's Rights, which will provide legal advocacy, support services, and educational programs to ensure that no other child experiences what my son endured. The applause this time was thunderous, with many people rising to their feet. In the front row, Diane sat with Marcus in his wheelchair beside her, both of them beaming with pride at how something so terrible had been transformed into something positive. Over the following months, the legal proceedings moved forward with remarkable efficiency. The video evidence was so damning that both officers eventually accepted plea bargains rather than face trial. Matthews received a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, while Chen was sentenced to 1 year. Both were permanently barred from law enforcement and required to complete extensive community service with disability rights organizations. The HOA that employed the officers faced civil penalties totaling over $2 million, money that was distributed among various disability rights groups and community organizations. They were also required to implement comprehensive sensitivity training for all security personnel and establish an independent oversight board to review complaints and incidents. Perhaps most importantly, the incident sparked a nationwide conversation about the treatment of disabled individuals by law enforcement and security personnel. New training protocols were developed, and many police departments implemented specific policies for interacting with disabled citizens. Marcus, despite his young age, became an inadvertent spokesperson for disability rights, appearing at several community events to share his story and advocate for kindness and understanding. 6 months after the courthouse incident, the community gathered once again, this time for the grand opening of the Marcus Williams Accessibility Center, a state-of-the-art facility designed to serve disabled children and their families. The center, funded by the settlement money and community donations, offered everything from physical therapy to legal advocacy to educational support. Judge Harris stood before the assembled crowd, watching as Marcus cut the ribbon with a pair of scissors adapted for his smaller hands. The smile on his son's face was the same infectious grin that had charmed everyone before that terrible day in the courthouse. But now, it carried an additional quality, the strength that comes from surviving adversity and choosing to help others do the same. "When I was little," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice clear and confident, "some people were mean to me because I use a wheelchair. But my daddy taught me that, when bad things happen, we can choose to make good things happen too. This center is going to help lots of kids like me, and that makes me really happy." The crowd's applause was gentle this time, filled with warmth and hope rather than anger and outrage. As the ceremony concluded and families began touring the new facility, Judge Harris reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed in just 6 months. The courthouse hallway, where Marcus had been humiliated, now featured a permanent plaque commemorating the incident and the positive changes that had resulted from it. But more importantly, the culture of the entire building had shifted. Security personnel underwent monthly training sessions, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior had been implemented at every level. Rebecca Morrison, the court clerk who had first spoken up during the incident, had been promoted to head of courthouse community relations, a new position created specifically to ensure that the courthouse served all members of the community with dignity and respect. She often told visitors about the day she witnessed injustice and chose to act, emphasizing how individual courage could spark institutional change. As the months turned into years, Marcus grew into a confident, articulate teenager who spoke regularly at schools and community events about disability rights and the importance of standing up to bullying and discrimination. His wheelchair, once seen by cruel officers as a sign of weakness or otherness, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. Judge Harris continued his distinguished career on the federal bench, but the incident had changed him as well. He became known as a fierce advocate for civil rights and frequently spoke about the intersection of parental love and judicial responsibility. He often said that being Marcus's father had made him a better judge, just as being a judge had given him the tools to seek justice for his son. The officers who had humiliated Marcus faded into obscurity after serving their prison sentences. Matthews struggled to find employment and eventually moved to another state, while Chen worked various low-paying jobs before eventually finding work with a non-profit organization serving disabled adults, an ironic twist that some saw as poetic justice. But the most profound change was in the community itself. The incident had forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about prejudice and power, leading to conversations that many had been avoiding for years. Schools implemented new anti-bullying programs specifically focused on disability awareness, and local businesses made significant improvements to their accessibility features. The Marcus Williams Fund continued to grow, eventually expanding beyond the local community to serve families across the region. The fund provided legal representation for disabled individuals facing discrimination, financial assistance for families struggling with medical costs, and educational scholarships for disabled students pursuing higher education. 5 years after the courthouse incident, Marcus was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for the Police Academy's new Disability Awareness Training Program, standing at the podium where his father had announced the criminal charges against his tormentors. Marcus looked out at the young officers and shared his story with characteristic grace and wisdom. "I want you to remember," he told the graduating class, "that when you put on that uniform, you're not just enforcing laws, you're showing people what justice looks like. Every person you meet, whether they're walking or rolling, whether they look like you or not, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not just good policing, it's being a good human being." The officers rose in a standing ovation, many of them visibly moved by the words of the young man who had transformed personal trauma into a call for justice and compassion. In the audience, Judge Harris and Diane watched with tears in their eyes, proud of the son who had found strength in his darkest moment and chosen to light the way for others. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered to celebrate, Marcus navigated through the crowd in his wheelchair, accepting congratulations and sharing hugs with new friends. The scrape on his knee from that terrible day in the courthouse had long since healed, leaving only the faintest of scars. But the scar on his heart and on his community's collective conscience had healed into something stronger and more beautiful than what had been broken. The courthouse hallway, once the site of such cruelty and injustice, had become a place of pilgrimage for visitors from around the country who wanted to see where one family's courage had sparked a movement for change. Children on field trips would stop at the commemorative plaque and learn about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible. And sometimes, late in the evening when the courthouse was quiet and empty, Judge Harris would walk through that same hallway where he had found his son on the floor. He would remember the rage and helplessness he had felt in that moment, but also the pride he felt watching Marcus transform pain into purpose. Justice, he had learned, was not just about punishment. It was about redemption, healing, and the courage to build something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. The story that had begun with cruelty and humiliation had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of love, the importance of standing up for the vulnerable, and the possibility of transforming even the darkest moments into sources of light for others. In the end, that may have been the greatest victory of all, not just that justice was served, but that mercy and hope had triumphed over hatred and fear. Marcus Williams had learned that he was stronger than he knew. His parents had discovered depths of courage they hadn't realized they possessed, and an entire community had been reminded that true justice requires not just laws and courts, but the everyday choices that ordinary people make to treat each other with dignity and respect. The wheelchair that had once been a target for cruelty had become a symbol of resilience, and the child who had been humiliated in a courthouse hallway had grown into a voice for justice that would echo for generations to come.